Thank you, Peter, for that lovely introduction. And thank you so much to all of you, members of the Red Circle, for coming and listening to me jabber on today. I will endeavor to make this interesting. This is a modified version of a portion of my doctoral dissertation, and I have done everything I can possibly can to lift that out of the murky, terrible academic jargon it had to be in its original stages. So this talk starts with a story that I learned from Daniel Stashower's meticulously chronicled Edgar Award-winning biography of Arthur Conan Doyle, Teller of Tales. And Daniel Stashower is here looking at me right now, so no pressure. There are a lot of bits of this talk that draw on that book, so I want to cite that now. No plagiarism here at the Red Circle. On Saturday, July 12th, 1930, at least 6,000 people assembled in London's Royal Albert Hall to hear Arthur Conan Doyle speak. It was to be a momentous evening of never-before-seen revelations, and the building was packed beyond capacity, with guests standing, crammed into extra seats. A row of 6 chairs had been laid on stage, with 5 reserved for the Conan Doyle family. One chair remained empty for the man himself. It was reserved with a sign. After several of Doyle's colleagues made introductory remarks, the evening's hostess, Mrs. Estelle Roberts, stood and spoke to the crowd, explaining details about the conversations she would soon moderate with the author. But this was no ordinary speaking engagement. Mrs. Roberts was a medium, and Arthur Conan Doyle had died 5 days before. And in front of all these people, at least 6,000, mind you, perhaps as many as 10,000, according to some contemporary reports, she was going to attempt to contact him from beyond the grave. Conan Doyle and his wife had planned the event themselves before his passing. For the last 14 years of his life, he had devoted most of his time and energy toward proselytizing on behalf of the spiritualism movement. Spiritualism was the fringe occult phenomenon that had taken hold of latter-day Victorians, advancing the notion that a spirit world coexisted with the real one, that as well as developing methods to communicate with them. I'm sorry, that was not a sentence. And then the important thing was developing methods of attempting to communicate with that world. Although Doyle had been interested in the occult sciences for much of his life, his wholehearted commitment to this phenomenon correlates to the premature death of his son in 1918. And many of you know the contradiction of Doyle's existence, this sort of double bind within him of science and, shall we call it, faith. He was an overeducated surgeon who achieved a medical doctorate at a time when that was not required in order to practice medicine. And he was the creator of the world's most rational detective. And yet, he spent his later years determined to advance a fringe pseudoscience. For a time in the 1920s, Doyle's preferred tactic to help legitimize spiritualism involved relying on spectacle, especially co-opting the reputations of various showmen. Perhaps many of you have heard Daniel Stashower tell of the following debate at a BSI dinner a few years ago, when Conan Doyle and Houdini sort of faced off on the veracity of spiritualism, with Houdini deploying his knowledge of illusions and tricks to debunk examples of otherworldly intrusion that Conan Doyle believed were real. And in the spring of 1922, Houdini invited Doyle to the annual banquet of the Society of American Magicians, scheduled for June 2nd at the McAlpin Hotel in New York City's Herald Square, to settle the matter. There, Doyle attempted to surprise and astonish the magicians in question by projecting images of clay models of dinosaurs, captured in stop motion by Willis O'Brien for the film adaptation of Doyle's prehistoric time travel novel, The Lost World. The magicians did not know that, and they were utterly bewildered. Similarly, on September 4th, 1927, Arthur Conan Doyle stood in front of an audience at Grotrian Hall in London, defending spiritualism yet again. This time by relaying a conversation he witnessed between a medium and Charles Dickens. Doyle claimed that the medium had relayed the phrase, spelled out backwards, "Boz is buzzing about." And Boz was the moniker that Dickens used in his early writings. His co-author, Herbert K. Brown, was Fizz. He was the illustrator, and Dickens was Boz. Sketches by Boz as an early compilation of those writings. So the medium asked Dickens about his manuscript, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, which he left uncompleted upon his sudden death of a stroke in 1870. It was published, but only like 1/3 of the novel is extant. The medium asked, "Was Edwin Drood dead?" and then reported that the spirit of Charles Dickens responded, "No, he was not. I was very sorry to go across before I got him out of his troubles. The poor chap had a hard time." If any of you think that this is what Dickens would have sounded like, I'm sorry. Then the ghost of Charles Dickens was asked another question about an 1873 version of Edwin Drood, which was assembled by an American printer named Thomas Power James, who had claimed that the spirit of Charles Dickens had come to him and dictated the remainder of the mystery of Edwin Drood to him. And he published the whole version. Conveniently, he was a printer, and he advertised it as the complete version of Edwin Drood. So the medium said, so Arthur Conan Doyle actually found credence with this story because, of course, he would. He said, "Yes, that I am endorsing this ghost-written continuation." And so the medium asked Dickens' spirit, is Doyle right? What did you think of this American's edition of Edwin Drood? And did you really dictate to him? And the spirit of Charles Dickens apparently said, "No, it was not dictated by me. Wilkie Collins would have done it better. Edwin is alive, and the Reverend Crisparkle is hiding him," which, if you've read Edwin Drood, those are some characters. So this might seem like another humorous interlude in Arthur Conan Doyle's adventures to advance the cause of spiritualism. But I think that Doyle's co-opting the spirit of Charles Dickens wasn't simply for any old celebrity endorsement, but specifically because it had to do with Dickens's known reputation as a showman. Doyle did not merely want any association. He wanted associations with individuals associated with the spectacular. So here in this talk, we come to Charles Dickens, Victorian London's best-selling novelist and one of its most significant celebrities. A writer with perpetual ambitions to be an actor, almost always thwarted, he was known as an incredible speaker and storyteller, an impressive lecturer and performer whose readings of his own stories would sell out theaters and halls time and time again. But Charles Dickens was even more of a showman than this. He had an alter ego, and it was an alter ego that knit together his own preoccupations with performance and the spectacular. It was in a manner that makes sense of Doyle's duality as a man of two worlds as well, the scientific and the deductive, and the flamboyantly fantastical. From about 1842 to 1852, Charles Dickens became very interested in magicians and amateur conjuring acts. His investment is evidenced by the increasing number of sleight-of-hand tricksters and low-level illusionists who appear in his fiction of this period. But his extant correspondence also reveals that he had begun to personally experiment with magic acts of his own and develop his own elaborate conjuring persona. In his novels of the 1840s, Dickens seems to be working out conjuring's opposing applications for entertainment and trickery. This investment coincides with the rise of an institution to which Dickens would turn his attention during the 1850s, the New Police, which was established in 1829, and specifically the Detectives Division, the plainclothes arm of the police, which was established in 1842. Dickens's fascination with conjuring provided a foundation for him to explore detective figures. And in this talk today, I'll illuminate this with a few examples from Martin Chuzzlewit, which was written from 1843 to 1844, and Bleak House, which was written from 1852 to 1853, which both feature detective figures who are described as conjurers. But first, I want to go back to Dickens's own conjuring persona. In the last few hours of 1842, Charles Dickens made his debut as a magician. His friend John Forster was hosting a New Year's Eve party, and the two men had, quote, purchased between them the entire stock in trade of a conjurer from Hanley's toy store in London, with intent to put on a magic show for their friends. Dickens was to be the star, and he was ready. Before traveling to Forster's home that evening, he wrote to his friend C.C. Felton, quote, "If you could see me conjuring the company's watches into impossible tea caddies and causing pieces of money to fly and burning pocket handkerchiefs without hurting them and practicing in my own room without anybody to admire, you would never forget it as long as you live," end quote. But the performance at Forster's home on New Year's Eve was a dress rehearsal. even though it was exciting for its committed executant and sophisticated legerdemain. The real production, for which Dickens was honing his skills, would take place on the evening of Friday, January 6th, the feast of the Epiphany, but also the birthday of his oldest son, Charlie, who was to be 6. This was part 12th night celebration, part birthday extravaganza, and he had gathered a huge audience for the festivities. He wrote, "The actuary of the national debt couldn't calculate the number of children who are coming here." He had arranged for a magic lantern and numerous other, quote, tremendous engines of that nature to entertain them. But the main event was to be Dickens himself. By now, he had perfected a long list of stupefying tricks and had designed a comical routine about them. His friend, the painter Clarkson Stanfield, would play his assistant, deliberately performing, quote, his part exactly the wrong way to the unspeakable delight of all the children. And Dickens was already known to be a vain and punctilious showman when it came to these things, and his amateur performance that he directed did not see a reduction in his standards. It was a night to remember. This 12th night act was, by all accounts, amazing. Rumors of which quality were eagerly spread throughout their circles, especially by Dickens's own friends and his friend Charles Landseer. A few weeks later, the wife of the American theologian Andrews Norton made Dickens promise to put on a magic show for her own children the following Monday. Dickens frantically wrote to Stanfield, who was traveling nearby, "Will you play my assistant?" Although only a few weeks had passed since Charlie's birthday party, Dickens had revamped his act for an entirely new audience, fully committing to this new pastime that he would spend the next 10 years developing. In 1885, 42 years after Charlie's 6th birthday party, Dickens's daughter, Mamie, who was 2 years younger than her brother, would remember her childhood was full of such performances, how her father would, quote, very often, dressed as a magician, give us a conjuring entertainment, end quote, when she was growing up. On December 26, 1843, Dickens was engaged as the main entertainment at the birthday party held for Nina Macready, the daughter of the actor William Macready. This year, assisted by both Forster and Stanfield, he stunned his audiences with dazzling feats of prestidigitation. Jane Carlyle, the wife of Thomas Carlyle, wrote to a friend, and this is unbelievable, Dickens and Forster above all exerted themselves till the perspiration was pouring down and they seemed drunk with their efforts. Only think of that excellent Dickens playing the conjurer for one whole show, the best conjurer I ever saw, and I have paid money to see several. Dickens noted in a letter to Macready, who was away on tour, of the evening's highlights, and said that these included the transformation of a box of bran into a live guinea pig, which ran between the children's feet and was the cause of such shrill uproar and clapping of hands that you might have heard it, and I dare say did, all the way in America. He produced a pocket handkerchief from a wine bottle, as well as, and I don't know what this means, a hot plum pudding from an empty saucepan held over a blazing fire kindled in Stanfield's hat without damage to the lining. That trick, wrote Jane Carlyle of the instant, plum pudding, and his others of changing ladies' pocket handkerchiefs into comfit and a box full of bran into a live guinea pig, would enable him to make a handsome subsistence as a conjurer and let the bookseller trade go on as it pleases. Dickens did not, as Mrs. Carlyle quipped, abandon his career as a writer for one as a career as an illusionist. But he had already begun to knit the two interests together. He had long been fascinated by public entertainments, and his predisposition towards sleight of hand can be noted as early as 1836, when he features thimble-rigged shell games in one of his novels, Sketches by Boz. He would later describe something similar in Nicholas Nickleby in 1839. Later, there's a pickpocket ring in Oliver Twist, hustling street artists. In the Old Curiosity Shop, which he wrote from 1840 to 1841, there are several traveling showmen dealing particularly in card tricks. There's a card trick expert named Sweet William, who in addition to doing these sleight of hand with cards, can derange the natural expression of his countenance by putting small leaden lozenges into his eyes and bringing them out of his mouth. Dickens also featured, I think there was this kid in kindergarten who could do that too. Dickens also featured an ineffectual card reader in a humorous scene in Dombey and Son, which was from 1844 to 1846. But more than install brief scenes of conjuring as motifs in his novels, his fiction of the period reflects an increasing investment in negotiating the relationship between, as I said earlier, conjuring's opposite applications of innocent entertainment and sinister trickery. For example, in Martin Chuzzlewit, which he wrote from 1842 to 1844, card tricks that are passed off as diversions are really means of great skullduggery. Jonas Chuzzlewit, one of the villains of the novel, is a magician. There's another magician in the novel who counteracts him. This question led Dickens toward a meditation on the figure, and it caused a change in his own performance stylings. After Nina Macready's birthday party, he wrote to his brother Frederick to ask for assistance in acquiring a more comprehensive magician alter ego. He said, "I want to hire for Twelfth Night a magician's dress. That is to say, a black cloak with hieroglyphics on it, some sort of doublet to wear underneath, a grave black beard, and a high black sugarloaf hat, and a wand with a snake on it, or some such thing." This demonical dress, as he phrased it to Macready, is an outfit not unlike the sort that magician characters would wear in contemporary burlesque or pantomime productions. But it also suggests his interest in presenting this figure as this exaggerated, otherworldly, or at least exoticized presence, certainly distanced from the habits of the average Englishman. Dickens's exploration came to a head 4.5 years later in the summer of 1849, when he made his semi-professional debut in front of an audience of family and friends at Bonchurch on the Isle of Wight, when he appeared in the character of the unparalleled necromancer Ria Rama Ruse, who had, according to the program, been educated Kabbalistically in the orange groves of Salamanca and in the ocean caves of Alum Bay. Dickens's act as the esteemed necromancer included a jumping card trick that the program stated he had learned during 9 years' seclusion in the mines of Russia, and a trick in which a card appears inside an unbroken loaf of bread, which he had studied during 10 years in the plains of Tartary. There was also a trick in which a wooden doll becomes invisible, performs enormous journeys in half a minute, and passes from visibility to invisibility with an expedition so astonishing that no eye can follow its transformations, whatever that means. This trick, the program notes, is so incredible that the necromancer's assistant, probably Forrester or Stanfield, usually faints on beholding this wonder. Many of the tricks in the program, a program that, by the way, Dickens wrote himself, had been displayed before at some of these other performances. But on the agenda was the now famous plum pudding trick, for example. But despite the familiar rigmarole, Ria Rama Ruse's performance is distinct for its consummation of a separate magician character who is both referred to as a necromancer and a kabbalist of wonders. His showmanship is framed intellectually. He is a wizard and a scholar, a master and a collector of unbelievable feats and facts and skills. For example, a subtitle below the description of a trick called the Pyramid Wonder asserts that Ria Rama Ruse had bought that rare trick from another expert. The transaction was 5,000 guineas, paid for the acquisition of this wonder to a Chinese mandarin who died of grief immediately upon parting with the secret. The acquisition of knowledge and the successful performance of an amazing feat are linked here. See, Ria Rama Ruse traffics in wonders, not tricks for shaking people down like Sweet William in the Old Curiosity Shop. Ria Rama Ruse suggests that the aim is not to trick the audience, not to pass something off as another, but to astonish, to make the audience experience wonder. That the ideal conjurer produces amazement rather than confuse or deceive seems to be the long-hunted nucleus of Dickens's 10-year-long exploration into conjuring, and it becomes a metacritical frame when reading the novels and essays that approach this territory. Besides Sweet William, there are 2 conjurer figures in his works during the decade that he was preoccupied with Ria Rama Ruse and these other magicians. But unlike Dickens's demonically dressed alter ego, Both of these conjurer characters happen to be detectives. The first is the evanescent Mr. Nadgett in Martin Chuzzlewit, which again was written from 1842 to 1844. He conducts surveillance and solves mysteries in ways that are coded as conjuring acts. The second is the omnipresent Inspector Bucket in Bleak House, which is written from 1852 to 1853. Now, it's accepted that Bucket is based on Dickens's imposing friend, Police Chief Charles Field of the Detectives Division of the Metropolitan Police, about whom Dickens also wrote as a conjuring figure in separate essays. But the thing is, unlike Nadgett, Bucket exists in a novel that sort of erases the mechanics of conjuring and just concentrates on the amazing spectacle, suggesting that Nadgett is the prototype of how to work together, the conjurer and the detective, and Bucket is the ultimate solution to this question. Nadgett, for example, reaches into his clothes and somehow produces a pocketbook from somewhere about the middle of his spine. The narrator later says, "Large as the pocketbook was, it was very full of documents, but he found a place for this one, and having clasped it carefully, passed it by a kind of solemn legerdemain into the same region as before. His clothes swallow the enormous folder perfectly as if part of a trick, and he exits the room." In Bleak House, the narrator Esther Summerson describes Bucket when he arrives in disguise as a very respectable old gentleman with gray hair and spectacles, carrying a large gold cane. This man claims he's a physician, and nobody knows that he's actually Inspector Bucket in disguise. But in a moment, he reveals himself, and Esther says the physician stopped, and taking off his hat, appeared to vanish by magic and leave another and quite different man in his place. These characters, these police officers, are presented as spectacular figures. They dazzle, intrigue, and enchant those around them through their methods of detecting and policing, transforming their own work of watching into something worth watching. With Bucket, Dickens seems to have arrived at a definition of conjuring that involves wonderment and amazement, producing information or evidence in an unbelievable way that adds to this incredibly favorable mystique. And this is what Doyle did as well in attempting to legitimize spiritualism. Let us think for a moment about what Doyle did to convince the room of magicians that there might be more in heaven and earth that might be dreamt of in their philosophy. He attempted to mystify, to impress, to buffalo them, to blow their minds, so to speak, to inculcate them a sense of wonder in them, akin to the kind of wonder that they, as magicians, produce in others. He wanted to convince these magicians that the magic he showed, which was stop-motion animation, was real, even though he knew it wasn't. And that's what a magician does. His demonstration actually did nothing, literally, for spiritualism because it was all fakery, all show. But that wasn't the point. Like Dickens, the point with all these spectacles is to accomplish what Dickens himself had discovered through performances. The goal was to access and broaden the imagination of the audience, to foster in the audience the suggestion and the possibility of magic. Because nothing in life is certain anyway. So why believe only in that? Thank you. I am told that there will now be a brief Q&A. Peter.
They say that you should only write about what you know.
Mm-hmm.
Did you bring a guinea pig?
Yes, but the problem is he escaped before you got here, so maybe we should tell the staff now of Alfeo's that there's a live guinea pig running around the kitchens. I was just relieved none of you got served him earlier. Yes, what's your real question? No, I'm a terrible magician. I can't even hold a phone in front of people without dropping it. Like, I don't know how I could be expected to do anything else. Does anyone else have any other questions? It's totally fine for you to Bev. Thank you.
I realize this is a piece of your document.
Well, it's a seriously rewritten piece.
Okay, but did you explore at any point the psyche of why someone was attracted to magic, and how that maybe moved into things like writing mysteries?
No.
Repeat the question.
The question was, in my research, did I ever explore like the psyche or psychological reasons why someone might be attracted to magic? And the answer is no. The only other thing I can say is that during this period, this period represents like an increasing encroachment of the Victorian state into everyday life. The plainclothes police officer was sort of everywhere in the imagination of everyday Victorians. They thought that the person sitting next to them at a tavern could be someone disguised, embedded, listening to them, and the moment they say something that they did that was a bit off color, they could turn around and arrest them. So the culture of Victorian England got increasingly paranoid after 1842. Magicians never stopped being popular. I think people always liked to experience wonderment and amazement. But during this period of great paranoia, there were lots of questions about the sort of purposes of disguise and conjuring and legerdemain. And there was an increasing fixation with keeping these things in places where they belonged, like theaters and music halls. And then there are novels that explore, well, what if those things weren't in theaters and music halls, but were sort of in everyday life? And that's one of the things that Dickens is exploring during this time period. When he's trying to become an actor, he's already like the most successful novelist in England. He's trying to become an actor. Everyone's like, why don't you stay in your lane and write novels? And he's like, no, I want to be an actor. I want to be a theater practitioner. He's trying to write plays. They're not that good. He's putting them on anyway. And he is like so in love with performing that he's constantly trying to figure out ways to negotiate the inclusion of this in the novels that he's writing. But he's also aware of this paranoid culture and figures like the police. He's friends with Charles Field, who's the head detective of the detectives division of the police department. And so he's aware that there's this culture of suspicion. And all of these things sort of came to a head in his mind. So the only psychological profile I can give you is that of Charles Dickens. But I didn't look into sort of why the average Victorian would have been interested in these things, because as far as I could tell, interest in magic and magic acts has always remained the same. It's just the circumstances around those are what changed. If that answered the question. Thank you. Yes?
Is Conan Doyle's inclination towards spiritualism, is any of that reflected in any part of the canon?
That's a really good question. I would say no, because his interest in spiritualism really ticked up when he was at the very end of his career writing Sherlock Holmes. I mean, we all know that he tried to kill him off at some point and had to sort of keep writing. He ended up, writing The Hound of the Baskervilles 9 years into the hiatus because he was like putting a new wing on his house. And he was like, well, I got to pay the, all right, I'll write another Sherlock Holmes book. But it's not going to be a new one. It's going to be backdated. It's going to be an old one that I found. So I think it's hard to say, because the character of Holmes had been created and was such a sensation for being an intense rationalist. And Conan Doyle's whole life was trying to go do other things. I mean, he wrote like 70 novels. He kept trying to go do other things, and nothing was as popular as Sherlock Holmes stuff. And he sort of had to begrudgingly come back and just write another novel or short story in that formula and then go back. So I don't think there's as much deviation, because with the Holmes stuff, he was just sort of like shoveling the sort of formulaic drivel in his mind toward the audience that expected that kind of stuff, and then he would go. It's weird. I just heard the voice of Arthur Conan Doyle tell me to say that exact phrase. He called it drivel. It wasn't me. I'm a medium. Anyway, but the interesting thing is that he kept exploring spiritualism more and more in his other writing, but I think he kept Sherlock Holmes pretty separate. And then he was able to stop and spend the remainder of his life working on these things. But Arthur Conan Doyle's greatest biographer is sitting right here, so he could answer the question more authoritatively than I can. Thank you. Michael.
Do we know if Conan Doyle read much Dickens?
I don't know this. I've looked into this. I think everybody read quite a bit of Dickens because he was extremely popular, and you sort of, it's sort of like reading Harry Potter in the early 2000s. Like, everyone came across Dickens, everyone read something, everyone saw some plays. I don't get the impression he was an extraordinary fan in the things I have read of his, but I also think that at this point, like, being a particular fan of Charles Dickens was sort of moot, because he was so saturated in the culture that everybody just sort of understood his importance, and Conan Doyle definitely was deferential to his greatness, but I don't think an extraordinary fan. But again, Dan Stashauer is right here and probably knows way more than me. This is my excuse every time. They're like, Olivia, what's your favorite part of your dissertation? I'll be like, Dan Stashauer is right here and he can answer that for you. Yes.
How literate was the population that were able to read these?
That's an amazing question. Literacy booms in the 19th century. All of a sudden, thanks to thank you for letting me talk about the Industrial Revolution on a Saturday at 3 o'clock. Because of the Industrial Revolution, the middle class exists for like the first time ever in London. People have two things which they have not historically had before. And I mean, by people, I mean everyday people. They have leisure time and they have disposable income. Kids, from lower classes are still in the workhouses instead of going to school, but there are more children going to school than ever. So literacy is actually on the uptick. One of the interesting things about the 19th century is that it's the first time in history when we actually get a sense of a vertical mass culture, in the sense that the people who are the least educated and the people who are the most educated have access to the same culture at the same time. Everyone is going to arcades to watch like little penny kinetoscopes and little cinema technologies, and people are able to go to the theaters, the certain theaters which had exclusive practices are increasingly open-minded about who comes, and every form of entertainment is really inexpensive except like the opera. So people from all classes are sort of intermingling and intertwining in these places. And the interesting thing about works by both Dickens and Doyle, even though they were separated by at least 30 years at the tips of their successes in the beginning of Doyle's career and the end of Dickens's, is that their works were appearing not really first as novels, but serialized in magazines. Magazine culture was crazy in the 19th century. That's how people read their news and read their fiction, and it was all affordable, and you would have kids on the street like flipping through looking at illustrations, and you would have people in Parliament like bringing their copies of The Strand under their arms. So people were reading more than they ever had because of the increased opportunities for education, thanks to the existence of a thriving middle class and social programs, but also because entertainment was so cheap and accessible. And there's really no reason why someone who's barely educated would have read Dickens and someone who was well educated would have not read Dickens. I don't know if I said that right, but everyone was reading Dickens. Michael.
But you also have the 1872 Education Act.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. I don't know. You want me? I can also go to the new poor laws too. Like I can be nitty gritty, but yeah, the Education Act is significant. Yes. And printing culture is also extraordinary at this time period. There are all these innovations in how to quickly produce these. I mean, like, to be a printer in the 19th century must have been like developing the computer in the 1980s. Like, it is impossible to overstate the technological innovations that were coming out year after year after year, just in these tiny tweaks to these machines that could allow rapid printing and inking and what's the word for how you make the type? But exactly. Linotype. So there are all these like extremely fantastic inventions that are making it possible to print 1 million of these magazines. I mean, it is one of the most extraordinary developments in the 19th century, the printing culture that allowed people to have access to all of this reading material constantly. Yes, Alan.
Plus all the taxes on newsprint. But my question is there any evidence that the Dickens game was anything other than performative? In other words, did he ever drink the Kool-Aid the way Doyle seems to have?
I don't think so. I think it was just his interest in performance, because he was interested in so many different types of performance. At certain parts of his career, he wanted to be a Shakespearean actor. And then, he's a dad, and suddenly he's like, I'm doing stuff for my kids. Wait a minute, this is so much fun, and my friends are enjoying this too. And then he gets to develop these things these hobbies, because they also coincide with the intellectual questions that he's pursuing in his craft. I don't think he drank the Kool-Aid. He seems to have absolutely no interest in spiritualism. He attended a couple seances, and as an entertainment, as many people did, and doesn't seem to have found them to be profound experiences. Thank you.
It seemed like, that what he mostly liked was being, as you say, a performer.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if the readings that he took on at the end of his life were essentially a development out of that. He wanted to ooh and awe the audience in the same way he had done as a conjurer.
Yes.
So you have these dramatic, incredible one-man shows.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and even when he was much younger, when he wrote A Christmas Carol, I mean, he would sell out the Christmas Carol shows, and he would perform all of the characters. He would do all these extraordinary one-man acts in costume, and he would have the whole book virtually memorized, and he would do all the parts, and he would do the narration, and he would sell out these halls time and time again. It was a thing you could do at Christmas, to see Charles Dickens read his own book, almost from memory, doing all these voices. Throughout his career, there were all these different touchstones of performance that he tried to incorporate into his career as much as possible. And if he had the means to fully convert and become an actor, he would have. He absolutely would have. Acting was not the lucrative profession that it sometimes is in the modern world. There were a few examples of people who were able to make very, very good livings as actors, but generally speaking, it was not going to be the type of profession that could sustain the objectively rather lavish lifestyle that Dickens cultivated for himself as a novelist. And but I mean, later in life, when he left his wife Catherine, he married and fell in love with a young actress. Like his, especially toward the end of his life, as he felt his his age and his physical limitations starting to mount, he clung to this love of the theater and this association with the theater even more, including by almost marrying Ellen. So there's that. Yes.
At what point did the falling out between Houdini and Conan Doyle become public?
I've got great news for you. Dan Stashower is here. And, as far as I know, I know. I'm like persona non grata at the Stashower family. So as far as I know, and please correct me if I'm wrong, this was a friendly series of debates and conversations. And then when Conan Doyle was invited, Conan Doyle is his last name, but he goes by Doyle. So when Doyle goes to the party with all of the magicians at Herald Square and wows them with the animation that he has brought from the Lost World adaptation that's in progress, he wows the magicians, and there was an editor from the New York Times who was in attendance who wrote about this event, and then Conan Doyle submitted an open letter to the Times like a day or 2 days later being like, so actually it wasn't magic, there's this thing called animation, and he sort of explained, and I believe that's the moment when this became at least readable news, like tabloid style. I don't know before that if any of these debates or conversations that they had as friends were public knowledge.
Once I start, I don't stop. No, if my wife were here, she would leave the room rather than hear me start. So you've done just fine.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
You often hear about Inspector Bucket in these potted histories of mystery detective stories. So how do you feel about Inspector Bucket in that history of detective?
Thank you. I have very mixed feelings about Inspector Bucket, a character I find extraordinarily compelling. The thing about Bucket is that he was written into Bleak House fairly late into that novel. He doesn't appear for many installments. Bleak House starts off as something of a domestic melodrama, something of a sort of omniscient workhouse tale. It's unclear. All we know is that there's a case. If anyone's read Bleak House, congratulations, because it's 1,000 pages. It's amazing, but it's a doorstop. And it starts with this interminable case called that's in the Chancery Court. It's a case called Jarndyce versus Jarndyce. It's a will contestation that has been going on for generations. And like the joke is that like babies will be entered as possible benefactors, and then the case will grind on so long that they'll be old and have died before they find out if they can even get their inheritance, because that is how long these technicalities have sort of been crammed into the case and are extending it. So it starts off like with the arrival to Bleak House, this home of one of the members of the Jarndyce family, several people who are involved or who might be beneficiaries of this will, and it's about their relationships. There's also an omniscient narrator who is describing various other characters, including this somewhat sinister lawyer named Mr. Tulkinghorn, because Dickens's names are always incredible, and a character named Lady Deadlock, who seems to have a secret. And so we're not sure yet how all these things are going to braid together, or even what the genre, if we could even apply the word genre to a 19th century novel, is going to be yet. Eventually there's a dead body, and then like 6 chapters later, we get a detective to show up. And it's one of those extraordinary things. You're like, now I know what kind of novel it is. And then Inspector Bucket is absent for 300 pages, and you're like, I thought this was a proto-murder mystery, and now it's not. So the novel was not conceived as having a heavy murder mystery plot, as sort of like Wilkie Collins would come to do in many of his novels. It was not conceived as a sort of murder mystery. It was conceived as this sort of like twisty, interesting, meandering legal family tale. And then all of a sudden there's this detective shows up, probably because Dickens had just gone on a ride along with his friend Charles Field of the New Police, and is like, oh my God, this is so cool. There are all these poor people and we're intimidating them. This is awesome. Because that's what the account reads like. I mean, like truly there are all these like low-level criminals who are just like in pubs and in their houses, like minding their own business, and Charles Field comes up to them and he's like, plotting a heist, are we? And Dickens is like, this is so cool. And so he creates Inspector Bucket based on Field. He even looks like him. And Field and Dickens had a lot in common, because Field was also a failed actor who chose to take out his performative proclivities in his unrelated profession of being a police officer. But Inspector Bucket, has this very interesting and imposing aura, and it seems for a long time like he is this completely upright figure, this absolutely dogged and responsible agent of the law who will take all these nebulous mysteries and maybe even the interminable Chancery case and find a solution to them. Then again, the first time we meet Inspector Bucket, it's in the law chambers of Mr. Tulkinghorn, a sinister lawyer, who it turns out has contracted Mr. Bucket in his own simultaneous employ. So Bucket is doing the work of the law, the objective work of the law, but he is also doing private surveillance and fixing for Mr. Tulkinghorn, events which later on lead to the death of a vulnerable child directly. So he's a problematic character. And later on, when he is responsible for the death of little consumptive Joe, who's like 6, because there's always a consumptive child in danger in Dickens's novels, because Dickens was very concerned about the plight of poor children. What happens to Joe is a sort of interesting moment where Dickens is clearly reckoning with whether or not his friend and the whole institution of the police are actually doing good work, especially if, as Bucket's character suggests, they can be kind of rented out as private cops for individuals with nefarious or complicated personal intentions. And Bucket, throughout the novel, succeeds. He sort of solves every mystery. Everyone's kind of a detective in Bleak House, but people do like a little investigative work, and Bucket shows up and he's like, oh, take that. And he takes their clues and, figures out everything. And then he goes and solves the rest of the problem. And he solves everything in the novel. He solves the Jarndyce case. He fixes everything. And even when he's not in the novel, he's mentioned. Like there are chapters about whole characters that have nothing to do with him. And there'll be a line like, and somewhere out in the mist, there's Mr. Bucket doing his work, keeping us all safe. Anyway, Esther was tired. And like this happens a lot, like the reminder that the police are always there. He's always watching. He's always afoot. He's looking out for us behind the scenes. But then later on, there's this, the little boy Joe ends up dead. I'm sorry if this is a spoiler, but the book has been around for 170 years. So like little Joe ends up dead, and this doctor, or little Joe ends up removed and is in this very dangerous neighborhood where he catches tuberculosis. and there's a doctor that finds him, and the doctor's like, who took you away from Bleak House where we were taking care of you and you were finally getting the care you deserve? Who took you here? And he's like, I'm too scared of him even to say. And like, this little boy is so terrified of the man who took him and brought him to like Lincoln's Inn Fields. It's a terrible neighborhood, and he's hanging around with all these objectively very nice, like Cockney workers, and but it is a scary environment, even though all the Cockney workers in Dickens are great. But it is a dark and scary place. It's cold. He's a child. He needs to be protected. And he's like, I'm actually having a great time, Governor. It's okay. You can leave me here. And Alan Woodcourt, the doctor, is like, no, I have to take you. You have to tell me who brought you here. And eventually, Joe whispers the name into Dr. Woodcourt's ear, and Woodcourt is shocked. And later on, it's revealed that the name that was whispered to Woodcourt, and this is a very long answer to your question, but later on, it's revealed that the answer to this little whisper is Bucket. And Woodcourt, the doctor, is actually recognized as the kind of like detective hero of this moment in the novel, that he is the one who is actually going to solve problems that actually have positive effects on the community and could potentially save this child if it were not for the nefarious actions of Mr. Tulkinghorn, which require Mr. Bucket acting as his agent and removing the child from a safe, healthy environment and putting him in a very dangerous one. So I think even though no one should ever accuse Charles Dickens of having a great plan for a novel when he started out writing one, I think it's clear that his opinions about the police and Inspector Bucket and even his friend Charles Field start to shift throughout the course of the novel. And sometimes we get these grand moments where we see the police as they should be. And then sometimes we get these moments where we see them as fallible human beings who are greedy or who have associations that they shouldn't have. And there's corruption. And all of these questions are negotiated in the figure of Mr. Bucket. So I think my ultimate takeaway of this character is that he's one of the most extraordinarily nuanced and interesting police characters, let alone general characters, ever written. And my opinion of him constantly changes as well. One more question, because that was like a half hour. Michael, you've asked like 6 questions. I have to make sure that anyone, does anyone else have a question? Michael, you have the floor.
I mean, just going back to your long account of Bucket.
My what account of Bucket?
But from the very beginning, you must feel that this can't be a heroic figure given his name.
But the thing is, what is a bucket? Is it an empty vessel, or is it like a repository for things that are good?
It's going to be a much more ambiguous figure, if not a figure of fun. It'll be something that you don't take someone named Bucket to be exactly James Bond.
I mean, Bucket's interesting. He also uses his name to great benefit. Like he's going in and hanging out with the Bagnet family. There's so many characters in this novel. He's going to hang out with the Bagnet family, and all the Bagnets have like little names like that make no sense. Like this is like Havana Bagnet. It's not Havana, that didn't exist then, but it's really, really crazy names. And he's playing on the floor with them, and he's like, my name's Bucket. Isn't that a funny name? We all have really good names. These kids are loving him. They're like climbing all over him. He's like their favorite cool uncle in the course of one dinner. And then George Rouncewell leaves, and Bucket's like, I'll go out with you, George. And they're walking, and he claps a pair of handcuffs on him, because that has been the gambit of this whole dinner the whole time. And so you're watching him be this great guy, and he can even use his name as a way to enchant. And, he says, my name's Bucket. Isn't that a funny name? And all the kids crack up, and he's just this wonderful, delightful figure. And then he turns around and claps a pair of handcuffs on an innocent man. And there are a lot of scenes like this with Bucket, where he's such a charismatic and such a delightful person, and you think that Bucket is being filled up with all this stuff that's good, and then you're like, maybe it was an empty vessel all along? I don't understand. So that's why I think his name is perfect. But I think, there's so much that you can put in a Bucket, and he's a character you can constantly apply your own interpretations or contradictory readings to, and it'll make sense. Yeah, exactly. Emily has one more question. Sorry, I'm just really, really fast. Yelled at me.
I'm doing that sneaky thing where I'm actually sneaking in a comment.
Okay.
Which is that I finally feel good about having been forced to read Bleak House.
Yay! Thank you, Emily. That's a great note to end on. Thank you all for having me. Thank you.